So let me read Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he couldn't see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore-fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost."
Just this week I was going down memory lane. I'm nearly 50. I know I don't look it. I had some work done. There was once a time that this message has a trigger warning for a number of statements. There was once a time before the internet. There was once a time, if you're not already shaking, where there were only 4 TV channels and no more. Saturday morning TV was a great highlight, and here are 3 programs on the screen that I used to enjoy a great deal. And there's a theme. Top left-hand corner is a very dodgy picture of Michael Praed. Do you remember him? He was an early Robin Hood with a perm. And then there was the Dukes of Hazzard in the middle, the outlaws running away from the police. And then there was the A-Team, top right-hand corner. Now there's a slogan that the A-Team had. I wonder if you can complete it for a magic star and a burger, perhaps. If you have a problem. No. If you have a problem, if no one else can help, and if you can find them, then maybe you can hire the A-Team. Now, there is a link between those 3 troublemakers and those 3 problem solvers, and that is they're all outlaws. They're all slightly on the edge of society. They're on the edge of the law, and yet they have a skill set that makes them lovable rogues. Heroes who were outlaws, heroes that were outsiders. When you want to get to know someone, who they spend time with and who they choose to spend not their time with, so to speak, you learn a lot about the person. And that's what Luke is doing in his gospel. Luke is telling us about the person Jesus Christ, who lived 2,000 years ago, the Bible claimed. And if you read the first few sentences of Luke's gospel in the original language, non-Christian people, non-Christian scholars, people with big heads, that's how you spot them, they say this is some of the clearest, finest quality of Greek grammar we've ever seen in Christian and non-Christian literature alike. So Luke knows his stuff, and he takes a great deal of care to record from eyewitnesses who Jesus claimed to be, what he did, what he said, and the people he met with. He meets with the powerful people, and he meets with the powerless people. He meets with men and he meets with women. He meets with Jew and he meets with Gentiles. He meets with the religious elite, people who looked great on the outside, who knew long words, who gave lots of money, who went to the right places. And he met with Jewish people that loved the Bible, and he met with people who were the outskirts of society, like lepers. Jesus met with every person in community. And this is something a bit like a magnet. What's really interesting, people that were religious, that were righteous in their own sight, who thought that God should be impressed with them, well, they were repelled by what Jesus said. But people who looked like they were the opposite to Jesus, like the lepers, like the prostitutes, like the pimps, like the lowly of society, like the poor, lots of P's in that sentence, they were attracted to Jesus. And we meet someone here in Luke chapter 19, in this big central section of Luke's gospel, where there's lots of people that Jesus met. And here we have someone who's very impressive. We learn 2 things about him from the first few sentences. I wonder if you noticed them. 2 different things, 2 important things, and 2, not 3 points this morning. Here's 2 things we can learn from Luke 19, 1 to 10. Number 1, anyone can come to Jesus. Anyone can come to Jesus. That's number 1. Number 2, this is how you come to Jesus. Okay? Anyone can come. Here's how you come. Let's go. Number 1, anyone can come. Look down, please, if you've got it on your lap, sentence 2. So that's Luke chapter 19, sentence 2, verse 2. We're told that this man is a chief tax collector and he's wealthy. That word literally means that he's ark. He would have received monies from tax collectors underneath of him. So it's like a Ponzi scheme or a pyramid selling scheme. And this man Zacchaeus is right at the top and he's getting a lot of income from other tax collectors that were doing his dirty work. Now, what we know from historians is that this tax collector word, this title, is not just a party killer in the modern world. It certainly was in the first century. If you said you worked for the IRS in America or worked for Her Majesty's Revenues and Customs in the United Kingdom, it's just a moment of tumbleweed at any party. And it's exactly the same in the first century. These were hated by Jewish people. So what you have, people like Zacchaeus, they were Jewish people who, as it were, got into bed, were in league with the Romans who were ruling the society at that time. And the Romans wanted power, and they used force to get it, and they had influence, and they wanted as much money as they could get from the people whom they conquered. So they wanted land, they wanted authority, they wanted power, and they wanted as much dosh as they could get. We're talking 80% of income. So they wanted 80% of the money of Israel, the money of the Jewish people, at least. And then here you have someone who co-ops with the thugs from Rome, called Zacchaeus, who was a tax collector. And he says, I will help you do your work. I will help you by betraying my people, and we'll run a shakedown. We'll do some extortion from my people that I know, that I grew up with, that I know, that I live alongside. And so Jewish people came alongside the Romans, and they collaborated in an extortion racket called tax collection. And talking about giving till it hurts, that's what Zacchaeus and his cronies wanted to do. So they skimmed off enormous amounts of money, exorbitant taxes for the Roman government, and yet they took on a fair cut for themselves as well. That's why verse 2, he's a tax collector, number 1. Number 2, he's very wealthy. Why? Because he was on the take. He was skimming off as much credit as he could. And what did his fellow Jewish people think about him? Verse 7, did you notice? Verse 7, it says, all the people saw this, what happens in our passage, and they began to mutter. Why? Verse 7, because they viewed Zacchaeus as a sinner. Why is Jesus hanging around with him? He should be hanging around with us. And if you stand back and look at this encounter in Luke's gospel, which you could do this afternoon, if you kept on reading Luke chapter 19, when you get down to sentence 28, just a few sentences later, you see that Jesus is entering not Jericho, but Jerusalem. It's Palm Sunday. And in comes Jesus to be crowned as king of the whole world, but crowned with a crown of thorns. It's a great paradox in the Gospels. In other words, Jesus is 10 days away from the end of his life, and yet he chooses to spend a good amount of time with someone in this crowd who's vertically challenged, who he singles out. And he's a nasty piece of work called Zacchaeus, who is a tax collector, who's very wealthy. And what happens in this crowd of very moral people, very self-righteous people, verse 5, Jesus looks up into a sycamore-fig tree and says, I want to spend some time with you. 10 days to go in his life. And he says, I want to spend time with you. Now there's a pattern. There's a pattern in Luke's gospel, especially in Luke's gospel, but in the other gospels, Matthew and Mark and John as well, but especially Luke, you begin to see a pattern that everyone who the world hated, Jesus loved. Everyone who the world puts on the outside of society, Jesus moves towards. He's not repelled by sinful behavior. He's not repelled by bad decisions in your life. Actually, Jesus moves towards people who the world hates and thinks are worthless. Just think of tax collectors. There's on the screen here, there's a number of references. 6 times in Luke's gospel, you have reference to tax collectors that were hated by the Jewish people because they were their own tribe and tongue and skin color. They knew them by name, but they were hated. But Luke speaks of them positively 6 times, not negatively. Only in Luke's gospel do you have the Good Samaritan. You might be familiar with that if you went to church as a younger person. This Good Samaritan who's a hero, but he's an outsider. Only in Luke's gospel do you have the prodigal son, where the father moves towards a son that wants him dead, who's spent half of his wealth, And rather than being repelled by the muck from a pigsty on his person, he throws a banquet and he moves towards him and he embraces him as the Father models brilliantly the Father heart of God, who moves towards us in our rebelliousness and sin. And what's the pattern that Luke's showing? Jesus, as God, as fully man, is attracted to outsiders. He's attracted to outlaws. And so anyone can come to him. Social outsiders like poor and foreigners. Moral outsiders like prostitutes. And if you're ceremonially unclean, physical outsiders like lepers. Jesus moves towards every single one. Because that's the heart of God, who came to seek and to save the lost. Religious people are repelled like that magnet. Irreligious, unreligious, nominal people are attracted to the person of Jesus. They're attracted by his acceptance. They're attracted by his welcome. They're attracted by his love. They're amazed at his deeds. Because Luke wants to show us the real Jesus. And the real Jesus is someone who came to seek and to save the lost. There's a big difference between religion and the gospel that Luke wants to see very clearly for us is in 4K resolution. In religion, you choose which one. In religion, any major world religion, or your own construction. In religion, I search for God. In the gospel, God in Christ comes to seek and to save us. It's a huge difference. Either it's on us or it's on God. I mean, look down at these sentences. Did you hear Jesus say, Zacchaeus, I'll come to you when? Zacchaeus, I'll come to you if. Jesus says, Zacchaeus, open up your home. Here I come. It's all on me. It's not on you. And our two friends this morning, Lindsay and Harry, understood this. That God comes to seek and to save the lost like them, like me, and even you this morning. You weren't after him. You never will seek out Jesus by yourself. But God works to draw you to himself for his glory. Verse 10, for the Son of Man, that's a title, that's a name of Jesus. The Son of Man, Jesus came to do what? To seek and to save the lost. What does that mean? It means anyone can come. Because it's not on you, it's all on him. Number 2, how do you come? How do you come? This is how you come. There's a couple of interesting phrases. Point number 2, how you come. Look at verse 3, please, with me. Verse 3, first of all, we see that Zacchaeus, it says he wanted to see who Jesus was. That's not the same thing as saying he just wanted to look at Jesus. I want to get a glimpse. There's Katy Perry. There's the King. There's Pat Cummings, who teaches English bowlers how to bowl. He wanted to see with understanding who Jesus was. Jesus was a celebrity of the time and of the day and of the age. So he wanted to understand who he was. And so Zacchaeus says, I'm going to go because I hear he's passing by. Verse 1, Jesus is on a road trip. He's at Jericho. And so Jesus is the person that everybody wants to see. The crowds are flocking to see him. They're lining the streets. And yet Zacchaeus' curiosity led him to becoming a Christian. I want to see and understand who Jesus is because I've heard rumors who he is. That's number 1. There's a curiosity in the character of Zacchaeus. Number 2, it's not just curiosity. There's a persistence. Did you notice that? Verse 3, verse 4, he had to climb a tree. He had to climb a tree. No one climbs trees unless you're under 18 or unless you're really, really desperate to see who's passing by. Now, here's the trigger warning. He's vertically challenged. I don't want to say anyone that, where's tall and where's short? I'm not going to go there. But he's vertically challenged. But here's the thing. When the baptism pool that came from Aldi was inflated and filled with Thames water, there was a message from the front that said, please let the elderly sit around on the chairs and please let those who are young come to the front. Now, if you're 6 foot or about, we could have locked arms and we could have stopped young people getting the best seats in the house on the front. So it's not that your height or your age stops you from getting to the front of a crowd. I've read this passage many times and I've only thought about this week. Look at verse 3 and 4. There's a persistence to the character of Zacchaeus because he's curious. He has to climb a tree. Not because of his height, but because of the crowd. The crowd don't want to let him in. They don't like him. They don't want him to get a front row seat. The crowd hates him. It's not because of his height. It's because of the crowd. He's a prominent, powerful man, and yet he's prepared in his curiosity to be persistent and to climb a tree to see who Jesus is. He wants to see the real Jesus. He's not desperate, but he's intellectually open to the person of Jesus. You can be in year 10, or year 10 can be a few years back if you're Lindsay. But if you're intellectually open, if you're persistent, if you're not afraid of the crowd smirking at you, you can find Jesus this morning. You just need to be curious, and you need to be persistent. And sometimes that means climbing a tree. Sometimes that means opening your Bible. Here's the third thing. Zacchaeus was welcomed home. Very interesting who does the welcoming in this passage, isn't it? Whose home is his? Look at verse 5. Jesus says, I must stay in your house today. I mean, Jesus has some audacity, doesn't he? Look at the tense of the verb in verse 5. I say verb just because there's a number of young people who should know what that word means. But Jesus has the audacity to say to Zacchaeus, not salvation will come. He doesn't say that. He didn't say salvation is coming. He says salvation has come to your house. It's present tense. Excuse me, it's past tense. I need to go back and get my grammar checked as well. It's past tense. It's actually a perfect tense verb. Salvation has come. This is something that already has occurred. And why has that happened? Jesus says, because I am here. Why has salvation come? Why is salvation in this home? Because I've come, says Jesus. Every world religion is different, and yet it's very much the same. Every world religion says you are saved if you do these things. Salvation is a process that never ends, and it's all on you, and it's a very, very heavy load to bear. It's a process, because salvation is a matter of what you do and whether you measure up, and it's never enough, and you have no assurance outside of Jesus. But becoming a Christian means this. You say this. Harry said this, Lindsay said these words. Lord God, I come to you not because of what I am, but because of who you are. I come not because of what I do, but because of what Jesus has done. Not because of my works, but because of his works. Not because of my life, but because of his life. Not because of my payment, but because what Jesus has paid on my behalf. Verse 9. Why has salvation come to his house? Verse 9. Because Jesus is in his house. And Jesus is salvation. Luke is telling you this profound point where Jesus is present, salvation is present. Jesus does not point like Muhammad does to say, this is the way to be saved. Jesus says salvation is found in me and me alone. I am salvation. But that's not all. Look at verse 5. I'm coming to your house. The crowd knew something that we do not in our modern society, especially perhaps post-COVID. In the first century, hospitality was a big, big deal. If you invited someone around for a meal, you're saying, I want to come in friendship with you. I want to become not just your acquaintance, I want you in my life. It's not a matter of food, it's a matter of relationship. It's an invitation into a real friendship. Look down at verse 7. You see what the crowd knows. All the people saw this, Luke says, and began to mutter. That's complain, that's grumble. It's an Old Testament word, really. He's gone to be the guest of. You never guess who Jesus has gone to be with. It's kind of talking behind your hand sort of thing. Jesus, do you know? Just stop. Jesus, do you know who this person is? Before you go there, do you know what he's done? Do you know how hard he works for those dirty Romans? He's a tax collector. Now let's just pause at this point. All of us know the reality, do we not, of the pre-hosting tidy up. Just be honest. Normally in our house, shoes find a way of finding their own place. Normally it's in the middle of the hallway. When it's the pre-hosting tidy up, they get kicked rapidly where they should go under the stairs. And a few words of authority are mentioned. What's the problem with anybody in this house? The shoes go under the stairs. Okay? Sometimes the Hoover is got out once a year for the pre-hosting tidy up. Voices are often raised. There is an urgency in our home. Sometimes, if we're really trying to impress, we commandeer one room in the house that is then forbidden. And you put stuff in there and your foot's on the door and no one's going in there. As if there's a dead body in there. No one's going in there. And all it is just a load of clothes that we don't want you to see and loads of untidiness and stuff that there's a few smiles, you know what I mean. It's called the pre-hosting tidy up. We all do it. Look at verse 6 and verse 7. There are three words in verse 6 and verse 7. It's the word guest, there's the word welcome, there's the word stay. And it all means room and board. In other words, Jesus went to be with Zacchaeus, and it wasn't just a quick flit in and out. He spent some time in the life and home of Zacchaeus. He stayed overnight there probably. He's saying, I'm coming home to be with you. There's no surprises for Jesus. And there's something very profound here, but subtle, but we must pay attention to it. Luke is showing us in this deeply profound story the order of grace. The order of grace. Jesus looked up into a tree and he sees right into Zacchaeus' heart. He knew all he had done. And instead of saying, Zacchaeus, I'll come if, I'll come when, I'll come. Jesus says, I'll come in spite of what you've done. I'll come with you in spite of your record. I'll come knowing about your collaboration with the Romans. I'll come in spite of your exaltation racket. Remember, you're chief. You're the arch tax collector. I'm coming to spend time with you. I'm coming into your life. And I'm prepared to love you first, even before you love me. I will move towards you. And only as a result of the initiative and love and compassion and grace of Jesus does Zacchaeus change his life. Zacchaeus does not clean himself up first. God moved towards him first of all. And what's the response? Verse 6, joy. So he came down and he welcomed him gladly. When he says, I'm going to stop cheating on people, look at what he says. He says in verse 8, look, Lord. There's emotion, joy about the grace of God in the life of Zacchaeus. When he says in verse 8, look, Lord, it's a bit like a child showing a parent, can you see what I've done? Look at my report. It's a good one. Look at this piece of art. Please put it on the fridge. Have you heard how many goals I scored today? I never said that to my mum or dad, but that's another story. Because of the grace of God, Zacchaeus responds with a changed life. It's not change, and then you get God's favor. It's the grace of God, and in response to the grace of God, a changed heart is revealed. Zacchaeus says, I'm going to give up to half of everything I own to the poor. I'm going to pay everybody back. I'm a changed person because God's grace has come into my life. It's a sign, isn't it? That God's grace has come, a changed heart, changed actions. Why was Zacchaeus so moved? What happened? What struck him for the first time? Well, he knew that Jesus Christ was bearing the disdain of the crowd. Verse 7, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. I think Zacchaeus was amazed that Jesus would love him at the cost to Jesus' own reputation. Zacchaeus knew what other people would think of Jesus if he came to spend time with him in his home. And it moved him. And it changed him. You come and have a meal with me, knowing how hated I am, knowing what I've done, knowing the damage that I've done, knowing the decisions that I've made. But what about you and me? Jesus does not just take on the disdain of the crowd. The crowd got more and more hostile during the next 10 days to Jesus Christ. To love you and me, Jesus did not simply love you and me at the cost of his reputation. The love of God is seen in the death of Jesus at the cost of his life. It was more than the disdain of the crowd. He didn't just bear the disdain of the crowd, he bore the death that the crowd put upon him as they shouted, crucify him. and they killed him. Central to the Christian faith is the cross of Jesus Christ. That Jesus died for the sins of the world, our rebellion against a loving God. A God who gives us what we don't deserve, his love, because Jesus got what we deserve, his justice. All the ways we've wronged the God who created us, all the ways we've wronged the people around us, and some truth of that came into the heart of Zacchaeus and it changed him. He was so moved that Jesus would lose his reputation. But how much more should we be moved that Jesus was willing to lay down his life? Zacchaeus came down from a tree. Jesus went up and was nailed to a tree. Jesus bore the disdain of the crowd, but later he was going to bear the weight of the whole world. And so verse 9, as the passage comes to a close, today salvation has come to this house. Now, how do we know that? Because of his attitude to money. That's quite clear. His attitude to money completely changed. Do you realize the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these 4 accounts, different camera angles on the person and life and ministry of Jesus, they say very little on the topic of sex. I say that because we have teenagers in the room. But there's absolutely loads that the Gospels say on money, because it's such a big issue for all of us. Again and again there's talk about money. If you come to me, it means walking away from trusting in money. It means walking away from loving money more than me. Maybe you'll get it back. Maybe you'll get 50% of the money back. Maybe you get 90% of the money back. I say 90% because the Bible says clearly that we should give 10%, at least 10%, the principle of tithing, giving money away to charity. 120% is the amount that you should give of money back to a person if you cheated them. That's from Numbers chapter 5. And so what is Zacchaeus doing? Verse 8 saying, I want to give 400% back to people that I've embezzled money from, people that I've knowingly cheated money from. What's Zacchaeus doing? Is he crazy? No, he's not crazy. Zacchaeus is doing far more than what is required because he's responding to God's grace. And God's grace always creates cheerful givers, generous givers, and he's doing it creatively. There's nothing in the Bible that says you must give 400, 500, 600%. But Zacchaeus is saying, I've been so wrong in this area of my life, I'm going to give creatively. I want to give 400% back. Why? Because money is no longer his treasure. Jesus is his treasure. And so he gives it away. He doesn't want to live for it anymore. Jesus, who was born in a manger, Jesus who died on the cross, the ultimate insider of the Godhead, Father, Son, and Spirit, became the ultimate outsider to take our penalty upon himself so that he could look on us with love. And then Jesus can say to every single person in this room, no matter what you've done, no matter what website you've clicked on, no matter what bed you've slept in, I want to welcome you home. There's a Christian historian, and he said at the end of one of his books, what made Christianity sweep the ancient world? At the end of one of his books, he says this, a reason for Christianity's success is to be found in its inclusiveness. More than any other of its competitors, Christianity attracted all races and all classes. In other words, anyone can come. And how do you come? By taking Jesus at his word.